What if I told you that one of NASCAR's most legendary mechanics figured out how to squeeze 5 extra gallons of fuel into a regulation gas tank without breaking a single rule? Not through clever engineering or hidden compartments, but by exploiting a basic law of physics that NASCAR's rulebook had completely overlooked. Picture this. It's 1968, and you're standing in the garage at Daytona watching Smokey Yunick's crew prepare their Chevelle for the 500. The officials have just inspected the fuel tank, exactly 22 gallons, perfectly legal. But there's something strange happening. The crew is wheeling out what looks like a modified refrigeration unit, complete with cooling coils wrapped around metal fuel containers. Ice crystals are forming on the outside. The temperature gauge reads minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. As they begin pumping this super-chilled gasoline into the tank, you can actually see frost forming on the fuel filler neck. The other crews are staring. The NASCAR officials are frantically flipping through their rulebooks. And Smokey? He's standing there with that famous cigar, grinning like he just pulled off the heist of the century. This is the story of how Henry Smokey Yunick, mechanic, inventor, and NASCAR's most notorious rule-bender, discovered a loophole so simple, so elegant, that it took NASCAR years to figure out exactly what he was doing. And when they finally did, they had to rewrite the entire fuel regulation chapter of their rulebook. To understand why frozen fuel was such a game-changer, we need to travel back to NASCAR's Wild West era. This was the 1960s, when stock car racing was transitioning from moonshine runners on dirt tracks to a legitimate professional sport. The rulebook was thin, maybe 20 pages total. Compare that to today's 200-plus page technical manual. Back then, the philosophy was simple. If the rulebook doesn't specifically prohibit something, it's legal. The racing was brutal. Daytona, Talladega, Charlotte, these superspeedways were fuel economy nightmares. Cars were burning through a gallon every 3 to 4 miles at full throttle. With fuel tanks limited to 22 gallons by regulation, pit strategy became everything. One extra lap on a tank of gas could mean the difference between victory and watching your engine sputter to a stop on the backstretch while the field roars past. Every team was searching for an edge. Some tried aerodynamic modifications that bent the appearance rules. Others played with tire compounds or suspension geometry. But fuel capacity? That was supposed to be untouchable. NASCAR inspectors would literally measure tanks with calibrated flow meters, checking capacity down to the tenth of a gallon. If your tank held 22.1 gallons, you were illegal. End of story. But here's where it gets interesting. Smokey Yunick wasn't just a mechanic. He was an engineer who'd worked on B-17 bombers during World War II. He understood fluid dynamics, thermodynamics, and most. Importantly, he understood that every liquid changes volume with temperature. It's called thermal expansion and contraction, and it's the same principle that makes your car's coolant overflow tank necessary. Gasoline, like all liquids, contracts when it gets cold and expands when it warms up. The change is predictable, about 1% volume change for every 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That might not sound like much, but Smokey realized the implications were huge. If you could cool gasoline from a typical 70 degrees down to minus 40 degrees, a 110-degree difference, you're looking at more than 7% volume reduction. Let me put that in perspective. Take 22 gallons of room temperature gasoline. Cool it to minus 40 degrees, and it shrinks to about 20.4 gallons. But here's the kicker. It's still the same amount of fuel by weight, the same number of molecules, the same energy content, you've just packed it tighter. Now, pour that super-cooled fuel into a 22-gallon tank. You've got 1.6 gallons of empty space left. Top it off with more frozen fuel, and suddenly your legal 22-gallon tank is carrying 23.6 gallons worth of fuel energy. But Smokey didn't stop there. He pushed the envelope even further. The technical challenge was immense. Gasoline doesn't freeze solid until about minus 180 degrees Fahrenheit, but it starts getting thick and syrupy around minus 40. Any colder and you risk fuel pump problems. Smokey had to find the sweet spot, cold enough for maximum contraction, but warm enough to flow through the fuel system. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He modified industrial refrigeration units, the kind used in frozen food transport. These could chill large quantities of fuel quickly and maintain temperature precisely. The fuel drums were wrapped in cooling coils, with glycol coolant circulating at -50 degrees. Insulated transfer lines prevented warming during the fueling process. The entire setup could chill 50 gallons of race fuel in about 2 hours. The numbers were staggering. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, Smokey could get 23.6 gallons of fuel energy into a 22-gallon tank. But he discovered something else. As the fuel warmed during the race, from engine heat, ambient temperature, and fuel pump friction, it would expand back to its original volume. By the time it reached the carburetor, it was flowing normally. The engine never knew the difference. Now here's where Smokey got really creative. He realized that fuel temperature also affected weight. Cold fuel is denser, about 6.5 pounds per gallon at -40 degrees versus 6.1 pounds at 70 degrees. That extra weight was actually beneficial. It lowered the car's center of gravity during the early stages of the race when the tank was full. As fuel burned off and the remaining fuel warmed up, the weight distribution gradually shifted back to normal. Testing showed remarkable results. On a typical 500-mile superspeedway race, cars needed between 110 and 125 gallons of fuel total. That meant 5 to 6 pit stops just for gas. With Smokey's frozen fuel trick adding effectively 5 gallons per fill-up, he could eliminate an entire pit stop. At Daytona, where a pit stop cost about 30 seconds under green flag conditions, that was a massive advantage. The competition was baffled. Smokey's cars would run impossibly long on a single tank. During the 1968 Daytona 500, his Chevelle, driven by Gordon Johncock, went 67 laps on a tank when everyone else was pitting after 55 to 60 laps. Other crew chiefs were measuring Yunick's fuel tank after the race, convinced he was cheating. The tank measured exactly 22 gallons. Legal as could be. NASCAR officials were in a bind. They knew something was happening, but what rule was being broken? The rulebook specified tank capacity, not fuel temperature. They tried to catch him by measuring fuel consumption, but Smokey was too smart. He'd vary his cooling temperatures from race to race, sometimes using fuel at -20 degrees, sometimes -40, keeping inspectors guessing. The frozen fuel wasn't Smokey's only trick with temperature. He discovered that different fuel components had different contraction rates. Racing fuel in the 1960s was typically 103 to 104 octane, achieved through tetraethyl lead and other additives. These additives contracted at different rates than the base gasoline. By adjusting his fuel blend and cooling temperature, Smokey could actually concentrate certain additives, slightly boosting octane rating in the process. He also experimented with fuel line routing. By running fuel lines through ice bath chambers in the car, he could keep the fuel cooler longer. Every degree counted. He calculated that maintaining fuel at just 20 degrees below ambient temperature throughout the race was worth about 2 extra gallons of effective capacity. But the real genius was in the execution. Smokey made the whole operation look routine. While other teams were frantically preparing their cars, his crew would casually roll out their refrigeration unit like it was a normal toolbox. They'd fuel the car quickly and efficiently. No drama, no obvious signs of anything unusual. To the casual observer, it looked like they were just being thorough about fuel handling. The psychological warfare was almost as effective as the technical advantage. Other teams were convinced Smokey had multiple tricks happening simultaneously. They'd waste time and resources trying to find hidden fuel cells, oversized fuel lines acting as auxiliary tanks, or special fuel formulations. Meanwhile, the answer was sitting right in front of them, literally freezing cold. Word eventually got out, of course. Other teams started experimenting with fuel cooling, but most couldn't match Smokey's sophistication. They'd try ice baths or dry ice, achieving maybe -10 or -20 degrees. Smokey was hitting -40 consistently, nearly twice as effective. Plus, he understood the complete system, not just cooling the fuel, but maintaining temperature, managing flow rates, and adjusting driving strategy to maximize the advantage. NASCAR's response was predictably slow. First, they tried spot-checking fuel temperature, but Smokey would vary his cooling based on which inspector was working. Then they mandated that fuel had to be at ambient temperature, but defining ambient became a nightmare. Was it the temperature in the garage, outside, at what time of day? The cat-and-mouse game continued for nearly 2 years. Finally, in 1970, NASCAR issued a comprehensive fuel temperature regulation. Fuel had to be within 10 degrees of the ambient temperature as measured at the track's official weather station. Random temperature checks would be conducted during fueling. Violations would result in immediate disqualification. But even this didn't completely stop Smokey. He figured out that he could cool the fuel to exactly the legal limit, say 60 degrees on a 70-degree day, and still gain about a gallon of extra capacity. He also discovered that certain fuel additives would cause gasoline to contract more than usual, even at legal temperatures. NASCAR had to revise the rules again in 1972, specifying not just temperature, but also fuel composition standards. The immediate impact on racing was significant. Teams that had been relying on fuel temperature manipulation suddenly found themselves short on strategy options. Pit stop patterns changed. Race distances had to be recalculated. Some tracks even adjusted their fuel allotment rules to compensate for the loss of temperature-based expansion strategies. But the long-term impact was even more profound. Smokey's frozen fuel trick forced NASCAR to fundamentally rethink their technical regulations. They realized that teams would exploit any ambiguity, any undefined parameter. The rulebook began growing exponentially. By 1975, it was over 100 pages. Today it covers everything from fuel temperature to humidity levels in the air intake. The innovation also sparked legitimate technical development. Engineers started studying fuel atomization at different temperatures, leading to better fuel injection systems. Understanding of thermodynamics in racing applications improved dramatically. Even modern Formula One teams monitor fuel temperature precisely, though now it's regulated to the degree. The story became legendary in racing circles. Other motorsports took notice. IndyCar, Formula One, even drag racing associations all added fuel temperature regulations to their rulebooks. Smokey Yunick had single-handedly changed how every professional racing series on the planet thought about fuel management. From today's perspective, the frozen fuel trick seems almost quaint. Modern NASCAR vehicles have fuel cells with internal baffling, electronic monitoring, and temperature sensors that relay real-time data to officials. Every drop of fuel is tracked from the refinery to the tank. The idea of showing up with a refrigeration truck and supercooled gasoline would be laughable. But that misses the point of what Smokey achieved. He didn't just find a loophole. He demonstrated that innovation in racing doesn't always come from exotic materials or cutting-edge electronics. Sometimes it comes from understanding basic physics better than your competitors and having the audacity to apply that knowledge in ways nobody expects. Modern racing engineers still study Smokey's approach, not for the specific tricks, but for the methodology. Look at what's not regulated. Understand the science behind everyday phenomena. Apply it in unexpected ways. It's the same thinking that led to blown diffusers in Formula One, flexible aerodynamics in NASCAR, and countless other innovations that dance on the edge of legality. The frozen fuel trick also highlighted a fundamental tension in motorsports that exists to this day. Racing is supposed to improve the breed, to drive innovation that eventually benefits consumer vehicles. But it's also supposed to be fair competition. Where do you draw the line between clever engineering and unfair advantage? Smokey's frozen fuel forced NASCAR to confront this question in a very public way. Here's something that often gets overlooked in this story. Smokey Yunick wasn't just trying to win races, he was making a point about American ingenuity. This was a guy who'd modified bomber engines in World War II, who held dozens of patents, who would later develop a revolutionary hot vapor engine that achieved incredible fuel economy. The frozen fuel trick was just one expression of his belief that if you understood the science, you could always find an advantage. In his autobiography, Smokey wrote that the frozen fuel episode taught him more about heat transfer and fluid dynamics than any textbook ever could. He applied these lessons to engine cooling systems, oil temperature management, even tire pressure strategies. The knowledge gained from chilling gasoline to minus 40 degrees ended up influencing designs that had nothing to do with fuel capacity. The human element is what makes this story timeless. Picture Smokey standing in the garage at Charlotte Motor Speedway, watching NASCAR officials scratch their heads over his latest innovation. He wasn't a corporate engineer with unlimited resources. He was a self-taught mechanic from Florida who happened to understand thermodynamics better than people with engineering degrees. He proved that in racing, like in life, sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. That refrigeration unit Smokey used? He built it himself from parts salvaged from old air conditioning systems and commercial freezers. Total cost, about $2,000 in 1968 dollars. The advantage it provided? Priceless. Victory at Daytona. Psychological dominance over competitors. A permanent place in racing history. Today, when everything in racing is computerized, regulated, and monitored to the 10th of a degree, there's something beautifully analog about Smokey's frozen fuel. No electronics, no exotic materials, just the application of a principle that's been known since the dawn of chemistry. Stuff shrinks when it gets cold. The legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Modern race teams employ thermal engineers specifically to manage temperatures throughout the vehicle. Fuel temperature is monitored not for capacity advantages, but for combustion optimization. The principles Smokey exploited are now incorporated into standard racing practice, just in legal regulated ways. Even the language of racing changed. Before Smokey, nobody talked about fuel temperature as a performance parameter. Now it's standard vocabulary. Crew chiefs discuss optimal fuel temperature for different atmospheric conditions. Engineers design fuel cells with thermal management in mind. What was once a closely guarded secret is now common knowledge. But perhaps the greatest legacy is the inspiration Smokey provided to generations of racers and engineers. He showed that you don't need the biggest budget or the factory backing to compete. You need curiosity, determination, and the willingness to look at old problems in new ways. Every time a small team finds a clever interpretation of the rules that gives them an edge over the big money operations, they're following in Smokey's footsteps. The frozen fuel trick remains one of the most elegant examples of finding performance in unexpected places. No moving parts, no complex engineering, just the application of basic physics to gain a competitive advantage. It's a reminder that in racing, as in any technical endeavor, understanding the fundamentals deeply can be more valuable than having the latest technology. As we look at modern motorsports with their billion-dollar budgets and armies of engineers, it's worth remembering that one guy with a cigar and a refrigeration unit once outsmarted an entire sport. He didn't break the rules, he just understood them better than the people who wrote them. And in doing so, he forced everyone to think differently about what was possible within the confines of a regulated competition. The next time you watch a NASCAR race and see those precisely choreographed pit stops, remember that it all changed because one mechanic decided to chill his gasoline to minus 40 degrees. Remember that innovation doesn't always come from the obvious places. And remember that sometimes the simplest ideas are the most revolutionary. What's the most clever engineering solution you've ever seen in motorsports? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into racing's most ingenious fuel trick, make sure to subscribe for more stories of the brilliant minds who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Until next time, keep questioning the rules.